Have you ever felt invisible, even while giving your best every single day? Laura Collins did, dedicated, yet constantly overlooked. Until one ordinary night, a simple mistake changed everything, and the last person she expected showed up to help. A silent gesture, an unexplained mystery, but what happened next will leave you speechless. If you believe in the power of simple gestures, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. The champagne flute slipped from Laura's trembling fingers, crashing against the marble floor of the corporate ballroom. Crystal shards scattered like tiny stars across the polished surface, each piece catching the neon lights that danced overhead. She watched them sparkle for a moment, mesmerized, before the room started spinning around her. The laughter and chatter of her co-workers seemed to echo from a distant tunnel, growing fainter with each passing second. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment as she realized she'd had way more to drink than she intended. This wasn't like her at all. Laura Collins had always been the responsible one, the quiet analyst who stayed late to double-check reports while others rushed home to their families. Tonight, though, something had shifted inside her chest, a desperate need to feel normal, to belong, to be seen as more than just the girl who lived for spreadsheets and quarterly projections. The company's annual celebration felt like her one chance to break free from the invisible cage she'd built around herself. But now, as the alcohol coursed through her system, she felt more exposed and vulnerable than ever before. The irony wasn't lost on her. She stumbled toward a secluded corner of the ballroom, her heels clicking unsteadily against the floor. Her vision blurred as she collapsed onto a velvet sofa tucked behind a towering arrangement of white orchids. The flowers seemed to mock her with their perfect elegance, everything she could never be. Laura's eyes fluttered shut as exhaustion washed over her like a tide she couldn't fight. The party continued around her, but she felt completely alone, invisible once again. Maybe that's all she'd ever be. From across the room, Ethan Reed adjusted his platinum cufflinks and surveyed the celebration with the practiced eye of a CEO who'd hosted dozens of these events. His charcoal suit was impeccably tailored, his smile perfectly calibrated for small talk with investors and board members. But something caught his attention, a flash of movement in his peripheral vision, someone stumbling away from the crowd. He'd spent years learning to read people, to spot weakness and opportunity in equal measure. Tonight, though, curiosity tugged at him in a way he couldn't quite explain. He'd noticed Laura Collins before, though he doubted she knew it. She was the kind of employee who worked with quiet intensity, never asking for recognition, but consistently delivering results that impressed him. While others networked and politicked their way through meetings, she let her work speak for itself. There was something refreshing about that, something real in a world full of carefully constructed facades. But seeing her now, vulnerable and alone, stirred something deeper in his chest than professional admiration. Ethan excused himself from a conversation with the head of marketing, his polished smile never wavering even as his attention drifted toward the corner where Laura had disappeared. He'd built his reputation on calculated decisions, on maintaining the perfect distance between himself and his employees. Getting involved in someone's personal struggles wasn't his style. It was messy, complicated, potentially damaging to his carefully maintained image, yet his feet carried him forward anyway, drawn by an instinct he couldn't name or control. As he approached the secluded corner, Ethan could see Laura's chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep. Her auburn hair had escaped its neat bun, framing her face in gentle waves that made her look younger, more vulnerable than the composed analyst he knew from board presentations. Her lipstick was slightly smeared, and there was a small run in her stockings that somehow made her seem more human, more real. The sight of her there, so utterly defenseless, did something strange to his carefully guarded heart. He stood there for a long moment, weighing his options with the same precision he brought to million-dollar deals. He could walk away, let security handle it, maintain the professional boundaries that had served him so well throughout his career. That would be the smart play, the safe choice that protected both of them from potential complications. But as he watched her sleep, something shifted inside him, a recognition of loneliness that mirrored his own, a vulnerability that called to the part of himself he'd buried beneath years of corporate armor. The decision crystallized in his mind with startling clarity. Ethan Reed, CEO of a Fortune 500 company, was about to do something completely out of character. He was going to take care of someone who needed it, no questions asked, no ulterior motives. As he gently gathered Laura into his arms, her head falling against his shoulder with complete trust, he whispered the words that would echo through both their lives. Sometimes, one choice changes everything. The camera slowly faded to black, leaving viewers with a question that would drive them forward. What happens when kindness breaks down the walls we build around our hearts? Laura Collins lived in a studio apartment that could generously be called minimalist, though the truth was far more complicated than any design philosophy could explain. The bare walls stared back at her every morning like judges in an empty courtroom, their white paint chipped and yellowing from years of neglect. A single wooden chair sat across from a card table that wobbled with each keystroke as she worked late into the night, the laptop's blue glow her only companion. Her closet held exactly 14 pieces of clothing, each one carefully maintained and strategically chosen to last as long as possible. This wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was survival, pure and simple. Every morning at 6:30 sharp, Laura's alarm would pierce the silence of her sparse bedroom, jolting her from dreams where her apartment was filled with warmth and laughter. She'd stumble to her tiny kitchenette, brewing instant coffee with water heated in a dented saucepan because her microwave had died 3 months ago and repairs weren't in the budget. The refrigerator hummed apologetically in the corner, mostly empty except for generic bread, discount yogurt, and whatever leftovers she could stretch into multiple meals. Her reflection in the toaster's chrome surface showed a woman who'd learned to make peace with having less, but her eyes betrayed the longing she tried so hard to suppress. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching this story from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. At the office, Laura transformed into someone entirely different, efficient, focused, invaluable. She was the employee who caught errors that others missed, who stayed late to ensure projects were perfect, who never complained about the workload that seemed to grow heavier each month. Her cubicle was organized with military precision, a small oasis of control in a life that often felt chaotic. But despite her dedication, she remained virtually invisible to management, watching as flashier colleagues got promoted while she continued to be overlooked. The irony cut deep. The more excellent her work became, the more she seemed to disappear. Meanwhile, 30 floors above in the executive suite, Ethan Reed carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders. The company his grandfather had built from nothing now employed thousands, but recent market pressures had turned every decision into a potential catastrophe. Board meetings stretched late into the night as investors demanded higher profits and lower costs, their voices growing more urgent with each quarterly report. Ethan's corner office, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and million-dollar view, felt more like a gilded prison than a symbol of success. He'd achieved everything he'd ever wanted, yet somehow felt emptier than ever. The pressure had started to crack his usually unflappable exterior in ways that terrified him. Sleepless nights blurred into endless days, filled with spreadsheets and strategic planning sessions that felt more like war councils. His assistant had started leaving antacids on his desk without being asked, and his doctor had mentioned stress-related symptoms during their last appointment. The weight of so many livelihoods depending on his decisions had begun to feel crushing, especially when he knew that some of those decisions might have to include letting good people go. Every name on the potential layoff list represented a family, a mortgage, a set of dreams that his signature could destroy. The corporate culture Ethan had inherited was one of ruthless efficiency, where emotions were seen as weaknesses and personal connections were discouraged between management and staff. He'd learned early in his career to maintain distance, to see employees as resources rather than people, to make decisions based purely on numbers and projections. It was a survival mechanism that had served him well during his rise to the top. But lately, It felt more like a wall that kept him isolated from the very people who made his company successful. The loneliness of leadership had become a constant companion, whispering doubts in his ear during quiet moments. Laura's own struggles with invisibility ran deeper than just workplace politics. They were rooted in a childhood spent learning that taking up space was dangerous, that being noticed often led to disappointment. Her parents had loved her in their own distracted way, but financial pressures and personal problems had left little room for nurturing their daughter's dreams. She'd learned early to be self-sufficient, to expect nothing from others, to find satisfaction in work rather than relationships. The pattern had followed her into adulthood, creating a fortress of independence that protected her from rejection, but also kept her isolated from genuine connection. The company party had been her one attempt to break free from the invisible box she'd built around herself, to be seen as more than just the quiet girl who fixed everyone else's mistakes. She'd bought a new dress with money she couldn't afford, practiced conversations in her bathroom mirror, and psyched herself up for a night of networking and socializing. But alcohol had loosened the careful controls she'd spent years perfecting, revealing the vulnerability she worked so hard to hide. Now, as she woke up in her own bed with fragments of memory from the night before, she felt more exposed and ashamed than ever. The collision between Laura's world of careful scarcity and Ethan's realm of overwhelming abundance was about to create ripples neither of them could predict. Two people, both trapped in different kinds of prisons, one built from necessity, the other from success, were about to discover that sometimes the most unexpected connections can shatter the walls we never knew we'd built. But would they have the courage to step through the cracks, or would fear drive them back to the safety of their separate, lonely world? The soft glow of Laura's laptop screen illuminated her face as she hunched over the wobbly card table, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced precision. Her wire-rimmed glasses kept sliding down her nose, a quirk that had annoyed her since college, but seemed insignificant compared to everything else she couldn't afford to fix. The numbers on her screen blurred together after 12 straight hours of analysis, but she pushed through the fatigue with the same stubborn determination that had carried her through countless late nights. Her back ached from the uncomfortable chair, and her stomach growled in protest, but she had 3 more reports to finish before she could even think about sleep. This was Laura Collins, brilliant, dedicated, and utterly invisible to a world that only noticed the loudest voices. She reached for her coffee mug, only to find it empty for the 3rd time that evening, the bitter dregs having long since grown cold. With a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her bones, she pushed back from the table and stood, stretching muscles that had been cramped in the same position for hours. Her reflection caught her eye in the dark window, a woman in her late 20s who looked older than her years, wearing a faded sweater that had seen better days, and jeans with patches she'd sewn herself. There was intelligence in her green eyes, a sharpness that most people missed because they never bothered to look past her quiet demeanor. But Laura had learned long ago that being overlooked was sometimes safer than being seen. The small photo tucked into the corner of her laptop screen showed a different version of herself. 8 years old, gap-toothed grin splitting her face as she held up a handmade certificate for Best Student from her 2nd grade class. That little girl had believed the world was full of possibilities, that hard work and good grades would open doors to a life filled with abundance and recognition. Now, staring at that faded image, Laura felt a familiar ache in her chest for dreams that had been slowly eroded by reality. Her parents had done their best, but love couldn't pay bills or fix the holes that kept appearing in their carefully constructed life. She'd learned early that wanting things only led to disappointment. Flashbacks flickered through her mind like scenes from an old movie, standing in line at the free lunch program while her classmates whispered behind her back, wearing the same shoes for 2 years until the soles were held together with duct tape, watching her parents argue in hushed voices about money while she pretended to sleep. Those experiences had taught her to be grateful for whatever she had, to never ask for more, to find contentment in simplicity. But they'd also planted seeds of shame that had grown into a garden of self-doubt, convincing her that she wasn't worthy of the same dreams that seemed to come so easily to others. The little girl in the photo would barely recognize the woman she'd become. Her one indulgence, the single thing that connected her to that hopeful child, was a leather journal she'd found at a thrift store 3 years ago. Its pages were filled with dreams written in careful cursive, plans for travel to places she'd only seen in magazines, sketches of the cozy home she imagined having someday, lists of books she wanted to read and languages she wanted to learn. Late at night, when the loneliness felt too heavy to bear, she'd write stories about a version of herself who was brave enough to chase those dreams, who spoke up in meetings and asked for promotions and believed she deserved more than just survival. The journal was her secret rebellion against a life that felt too small for the vastness of her imagination. At work, Laura had perfected the art of being professionally present while emotionally invisible. She arrived early, stayed late, and produced flawless work that made her supervisors look good. Her cubicle was a study in organized efficiency, every pen in its place, every file meticulously labeled. She'd developed a reputation as the person who could fix any problem, who never complained about impossible deadlines or unreasonable requests. But her dedication had become a trap. The better she performed, the more indispensable she became in her current role, and the less likely anyone was to consider her for advancement. She was too valuable where she was to be moved anywhere else. The company party had been her attempt to break free from that pattern, to show her colleagues that there was more to Laura Collins than spreadsheets and data analysis. She'd spent weeks psyching herself up for it, practicing small talk in her bathroom mirror and researching current events, so she'd have something interesting to contribute to conversations. The new dress had cost her grocery money for a week, but she'd convinced herself it was an investment in her future. For a few hours, she'd managed to laugh and socialize, to feel like maybe she belonged in that glittering world of corporate success. Then the alcohol had stripped away her carefully constructed confidence, leaving her more vulnerable than ever. Now, sitting alone in her sparse apartment with fragments of embarrassing memories from the night before, Laura felt the familiar weight of shame settling over her shoulders like an old, uncomfortable coat. She remembered laughing too loudly at someone's joke, stumbling on her way to the bathroom, the pitying looks from colleagues who'd probably never struggled to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. The details were fuzzy, but the feeling of being exposed, of having her carefully maintained facade crumble in public, was crystal clear. She'd worked so hard to be professional, composed, unremarkable, and in one night she'd managed to undo years of careful image management. But there was something else tugging at the edges of her memory, something warm and protective that didn't quite fit with her narrative of humiliation and failure. A sense of being cared for, of strong arms and a gentle voice, of waking up safely in her own bed with no memory of how she'd gotten there. It felt like a dream, too kind to be real, too gentle to have happened to someone like her. As Laura closed her laptop and prepared for another night of restless sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted during those lost hours, that her carefully ordered world was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The question that would haunt her dreams was simple but terrifying. Was she brave enough to let it happen? The whispers started on Monday morning like poison, spreading through the office's open-plan layout. Laura could feel eyes following her as she made her way to her cubicle, could sense the subtle shift in conversations that happened whenever she passed by. "Did you see her at the party?" she heard someone murmur from behind a partition. "I heard she had to be carried out." The words hit her like physical blows, each syllable confirming her worst fears about that night. Her hands trembled as she powered up her computer, trying to project an air of normalcy while her stomach churned with anxiety. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of, becoming the office gossip, the cautionary tale people would whisper about for months. By Wednesday, the rumors had evolved into something far more sinister. Jennifer from accounting cornered her in the break room, her voice dripping with false concern as she delivered the devastating news. Laura, honey, I thought you should know. They're talking about layoffs again. Budget cuts, you know how it is. Her smile didn't reach her eyes as she continued. I heard your department might be hit pretty hard. Such a shame, especially after, well, you know. The implication hung in the air like smoke, choking Laura with its implications. Had her behavior at the party somehow put her job at risk? The thought made her blood run cold. Her apartment seemed to mock her growing despair, with its bare walls and empty spaces. The rent notice taped to her door served as a cruel reminder that she was already living paycheck to paycheck, with no safety net to catch her if she fell. As she sat on her single chair, staring at her bank balance on her phone screen, the numbers seemed to blur together through tears she refused to let fall. $57.32 stood between her and complete financial disaster. If she lost her job now, she wouldn't even have enough for next month's rent, let alone food or utilities. The weight of her precarious situation pressed down on her chest like a physical force. Thursday brought a new crisis that felt like the universe was testing her resolve. A steady drip-drop echoed through her apartment, drawing her attention to a dark stain spreading across her bedroom ceiling like a slow-motion catastrophe. The upstairs neighbor's bathroom leak had finally broken through, sending rusty water cascading into her space with relentless persistence. She called her landlord 3 times, each conversation more frustrating than the last, only to be told that repairs weren't scheduled until sometime next week. Meanwhile, her few possessions sat under a growing collection of pots and bowls, the rhythmic dripping serving as a constant reminder of how little control she had over her own life. 30 floors above Laura's struggles, Ethan Reed faced his own mounting pressures in the gleaming boardroom where his company's fate was decided. The quarterly reports spread across the mahogany table told a story he didn't want to acknowledge: declining profits, increased competition, and investor demands that grew more aggressive with each passing meeting. We need to cut costs by 20%, demanded Harrison Mills, the lead investor whose cold grey eyes showed no mercy for sentiment. Personnel expenses are our biggest liability. I don't care how talented they are. If they're not generating revenue, they need to go. The words echoed in Ethan's mind as he stared at the list of potential terminations his HR director had compiled. The irony wasn't lost on him that success had become its own prison, trapping him in a cycle of decisions that felt increasingly disconnected from the values his grandfather had instilled in him when he'd first joined the company. Each name on the layoff list represented a person, a family, a set of dreams that his signature could destroy with a single stroke. He'd spent sleepless nights reviewing performance reports, trying to find alternatives that would satisfy the board's demands without sacrificing good people. But the math was unforgiving, and the pressure from investors was growing stronger every day. Sometimes he wondered if his grandfather would recognize the company he'd built with his bare hands. Laura's name appeared on page 3 of the termination list, buried among dozens of other employees whose only crime was working in departments deemed non-essential. Ethan's finger paused over her performance reviews, which painted a picture of someone who consistently exceeded expectations despite being chronically undervalued. Her direct supervisor had written glowing assessments year after year, praising her attention to detail and ability to solve complex problems under pressure. She was exactly the kind of employee any company would be lucky to have: dedicated, skilled, and utterly reliable. Yet here she was, marked for elimination because her department didn't generate direct revenue. A memory flickered in Ethan's mind, Laura's face in the dim light of the company party, vulnerable and trusting as he'd carried her to safety. There had been something about her apartment that night, something that had haunted him in the days since. The emptiness, the careful way every possession had been arranged to maximize utility, the refrigerator that held more condiments than food. It had been like looking into a mirror of his own loneliness, but hers was born from necessity while his came from abundance. The contrast had shaken something loose in his chest, a recognition of shared isolation that crossed all boundaries of class and position. As Laura struggled with leaky ceilings and whispered gossip, and Ethan grappled with impossible decisions and investor pressure, neither could have predicted how their separate crises were about to intersect in ways that would change everything. The threads of their lives were pulling tighter, drawing them toward a moment of collision that would force both of them to confront the walls they'd built around their hearts. But first, they would have to survive the growing storms that threatened to sweep away everything they'd worked so hard to build. The question remained, when the foundations of their carefully constructed lives began to crumble, would they find the courage to reach for each other, or would pride and fear keep them trapped in their separate struggles? Something had shifted inside Ethan Reed during the drive to Laura's apartment that night, something he couldn't quite name, but couldn't ignore. As he'd navigated the dark streets with her sleeping peacefully in his passenger seat, he'd felt a strange sense of purpose that had nothing to do with quarterly reports or board meetings. Her head had lolled against the window, and occasionally she'd murmur something inaudible, her face relaxed in a way he'd never seen during their brief professional interactions. There was a vulnerability about her that called to something deep in his chest, a protective instinct he'd thought had died years ago under the weight of corporate responsibility. This wasn't the calculated decision-making that had built his empire. This was pure human instinct. The first glimpse of her apartment had hit him like a physical blow, stripping away every assumption he'd made about how his employees lived. The hallway smelled of old carpet and industrial cleaner, a sharp contrast to the leather and mahogany world he inhabited. Her door was painted beige, unremarkable among dozens of identical entrances, with a cheap brass number that had started to tarnish. As he'd fumbled with her keys, finding the right one by trial and error, he'd wondered how many nights she'd stood in this same spot, tired from long hours at the office, coming home to... What exactly? He was about to find out, and part of him wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. The moment he'd stepped inside, the emptiness had wrapped around him like a living thing, making him acutely aware of the hollowness that could exist in such a small space. Her living area consisted of a single folding chair positioned in front of a card table that had seen better days, the kind of furniture college students discarded when they got their first real jobs. The walls were bare, except for water stains and nail holes where pictures had once hung, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a temporary shelter than a home. There was no couch, no television, no personal touches that might reveal who Laura Collins really was. Beneath her professional facade, it was like stepping into the physical manifestation of loneliness itself. He'd carried her to what he assumed was the bedroom, only to find a mattress on the floor covered with sheets that, while clean, were clearly worn thin from years of use. A small dresser with a cracked mirror sat in one corner, and a single window looked out onto the brick wall of the neighboring building. The overhead bulb cast harsh shadows that made everything look even more stark and unwelcoming. As he'd gently placed her on the bed and pulled a thin blanket over her sleeping form, Ethan had felt something crack open in his chest, a recognition of just how little some people had to work with and how much he'd taken for granted in his own gilded existence. Walking back through her apartment on his way out, he'd noticed details that painted a picture of someone who'd learned to live with almost nothing but had tried to make it work anyway. The refrigerator hummed loudly, its white surface yellowed with age, and when he'd opened it out of concern for her well-being, he'd found it nearly empty, except for generic yogurt, day-old bread, and condiment packets she'd probably saved from takeout meals. Her cupboards contained instant coffee, generic cereal, and canned soup, the diet of someone who ate to survive, not to enjoy. The whole place felt like a monument to making do, to finding dignity in deprivation, and it had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Something had fundamentally changed in Ethan during that quiet drive home, his luxury sedan feeling absurdly spacious after the cramped intimacy of Laura's world. He'd built his life around the idea that hard work was always rewarded, that dedication inevitably led to prosperity, that anyone could climb the ladder if they just tried hard enough. But Laura Collins had shattered that comfortable myth with the simple fact of her existence. She worked harder than most of his executives, produced better results than employees who made 3 times her salary, and still came home to an apartment that looked like it belonged to someone who'd given up on comfort entirely. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. By the time he'd reached his penthouse, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and carefully curated art collection, Ethan had made a decision that surprised even him. He wasn't going to let Laura's dedication go unrecognized any longer, but he also wasn't going to make a show of it that might embarrass her or create office politics that could damage her career. Instead, he'd find a way to help that preserved her dignity while acknowledging what she'd given to the company. It was the kind of gesture his grandfather might have made back when the business was small enough for personal connections to matter. Maybe it was time to remember those values. The next morning, Ethan had called in favors and made arrangements with the discretion that came from years of high-stakes negotiations. A local furniture store, a grocery delivery service, and a home goods retailer all received calls from a mysterious benefactor who wanted to remain anonymous. The instructions were specific but simple. Transform an apartment from bare survival into something that felt like home, and do it with enough class to honor the recipient without overwhelming her. The deliveries would be scheduled for the afternoon when she'd be at work, signed for by the building superintendent, with everything labeled as gifts from a grateful friend. As Ethan signed the checks that would change Laura's living situation in a single afternoon, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the simple satisfaction of using his resources to solve a problem that actually mattered. This wasn't about tax write-offs or public relations. It was about recognizing someone who'd been overlooked for far too long. The irony wasn't lost on him that in trying to help Laura, he was also helping himself, filling a void in his own life that he'd pretended didn't exist. But as he sealed the final envelope and handed it to his assistant with instructions to ensure complete anonymity, one question lingered in his mind. How would Laura react when she discovered that someone had been paying attention all along? Laura's hands trembled as she inserted her key into the apartment door, exhausted from another 12-hour day of trying to prove her worth while dodging whispered conversations about layoffs. Her feet ached in shoes that had been resoled twice, and her stomach gnawed at itself, having survived on vending machine crackers and black coffee since morning. She'd spent the day obsessing over every project, double-checking every calculation, desperate to make herself indispensable in a company that seemed determined to view her as expendable. All she wanted was to collapse into her single chair and lose herself in the mindless routine of instant noodles and laptop work. But as the door swung open, her world tilted off its axis completely. The apartment that greeted her was unrecognizable, transformed from a stark monument to survival into something that actually felt like home. A comfortable sofa sat where her card table used to be, upholstered in soft grey fabric that looked like it had been chosen specifically for someone who needed comfort after long, difficult days. A real dining table occupied the center of the room, surrounded by matching chairs that didn't wobble when touched. Warm floor lamps cast gentle light across walls that were no longer bare, adorned with simple but elegant artwork that somehow captured the feeling of hope without being overly sentimental. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to process the impossibility of what she was seeing. The kitchen had been completely stocked with everything she'd dreamed of but never dared to buy. A coffee maker that could brew real coffee, not the instant powder she'd been surviving on for months. The refrigerator, still the same yellowed appliance, was now filled to capacity with fresh vegetables, quality meats, dairy products that hadn't been marked down for quick sale, and even luxury items like imported cheese and craft beer. Tears began streaming down her face as she opened cabinet after cabinet, finding them filled with spices, canned goods, pasta, rice, and all the ingredients needed to cook actual meals instead of just surviving on whatever was cheapest. Someone had thought about what she needed, what she'd been doing without, and had filled every gap with care and attention to detail. Her bedroom had been transformed into a sanctuary she never could have imagined affording. A real bed frame held a mattress that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel, dressed with sheets so soft they felt like silk against her fingertips. A proper dresser with a mirror that wasn't cracked stood against one wall, and blackout curtains hung at the window, promising actual restful sleep instead of the fitful naps she'd been getting. On the nightstand sat a small card in elegant script that simply read, "From a grateful friend who believes everyone deserves comfort." The words blurred through her tears as she sank onto the new bed, overwhelmed by the kindness of someone she couldn't identify but who clearly knew her struggles intimately. For 3 days, Laura moved through her transformed apartment like someone walking through a dream, afraid that touching too much might cause it all to disappear. She called the building superintendent, the furniture stores, even the delivery companies, but everyone gave her the same story. An anonymous benefactor had arranged everything, paying in full, with strict instructions that the recipient's identity remained confidential. The mystery ate at her, especially during quiet moments when she'd catch herself wondering who could have possibly known how desperate her situation had become. The timing felt too perfect to be coincidence, too personal to be random charity, too generous to be anything but love, disguised as kindness. On Thursday morning, fate intervened in the form of a broken elevator that forced Laura to take the stairs to her floor. She was struggling with an armload of grocery bags, real groceries bought with money she could now spend on food instead of just surviving, when she nearly collided with Ethan Reed on the landing between the 15th and 16th floors. He was checking his phone, probably dealing with some crisis that required his immediate attention, but when he looked up and saw her struggling, something shifted in his expression. Their eyes met for a moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should have, and Laura felt that same warm recognition she couldn't quite place from her fragmented memories of the party. "Here, let me help you with those," Ethan said, reaching for her grocery bags with a naturalness that surprised them both. His hands brushed hers as he took the heaviest bag, and Laura felt an electric jolt of connection that had nothing to do with static electricity. They climbed the remaining flights in comfortable silence, and she found herself stealing glances at his profile, noting the way his jaw tensed slightly when he was thinking, the small scar near his left temple that made him seem more human than the untouchable CEO she'd imagined him to be. There was something familiar about his presence, something that made her feel safe in a way she couldn't explain or rationalize. When they reached her floor, Laura turned to thank him, but the words that tumbled out of her mouth surprised even her. "I don't know if you had anything to do with what happened to my apartment," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if you did, thank you. I've never had anyone take care of me like that before." She watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of recognition or guilt, but his expression remained carefully neutral. Only his eyes betrayed him, softening with something that looked like tenderness mixed with relief that she wasn't angry or embarrassed by the gesture. Ethan set down her groceries and looked at her directly, his professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the man beneath the title. "Laura," he said, her name sounding different in his voice than it ever had before. "Sometimes the people who take care of everyone else deserve to be taken care of too. Whoever helped you, they probably just recognize someone who's been giving more than they've been getting for way too long." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, but both could see clearly now. As Laura unlocked her door and Ethan waited for the elevator to return, both of them carried the weight of a connection that had moved far beyond the boundaries of boss and employee into something infinitely more complicated and potentially transformative. The office buzzed with a tension Laura could almost taste. Whispers clung to the hallways like smoke after a fire, growing thicker by the hour. She kept her head down, fingers moving across the keyboard, pretending not to notice the glances exchanged behind cubicle walls. But by lunchtime, the rumor had a name. Her name. A junior associate brushed past her and muttered under his breath, "Dead woman walking." Her breath caught. Was it true? An icy panic settled in her chest as she slipped into the bathroom, locking the door behind her. Hands trembling, she pulled out her phone and checked the internal portal. And there it was, her employee ID number, listed, category, pending termination, cost optimization, round 2. The words blurred through tears that came without warning. The apartment, the furniture, the full fridge. It all felt like a cruel joke now. Like the universe had dressed her life in beauty just to rip it away again. She slid to the tiled floor, knees to her chest, back pressed against the stall wall. Shame crept in like cold air under a door. Had she been foolish to hope? Was this her punishment for letting her guard down, for believing, even for a second, that maybe she deserved something better? A knock at the door startled her. She quickly wiped her face, stood up, adjusted her blazer, and stared at herself in the mirror. "Get it together," she whispered. "You've survived worse." Ethan, meanwhile, stood before a wall of windows 30 floors above, jaw clenched, fingers white around the edge of a report. The board had spoken, cut costs, layoffs, ruthlessly. Names had been highlighted in red, and Laura's was one of them. He'd argued, of course. "She's essential, one of our best." But Harrison Mills, the investor with a heart made of numbers, simply replied, "She doesn't generate revenue. She's expendable." Ethan had spent years hardening himself for moments like this, but this time it hurt. As the pressure built, the facade of control cracked. During a leadership meeting, while presentations droned on, Ethan's mind wandered. Back to the apartment, the silence, the fridge, her shoes by the door. No one else saw what he saw that night, not just poverty, but dignity. And it gnawed at him now. Was he really going to let them erase her like she never mattered? Later that day, Laura headed to the elevator, head low when the worst happened. Trevor from compliance, the kind who never missed a chance to stir trouble, leaned in and whispered just loud enough, "Smart move, cozying up to the CEO. Guess sleeping your way to job security is trending now, huh?" The words hit like a slap. Her spine stiffened. She turned to face him, but all she managed was a choked, "What did you just say?" Trevor smirked, unbothered. "Come on, Laura. New furniture, office sympathy. You're not exactly subtle." The elevator opened behind her, but she didn't move. Her cheeks burned. For the first time in weeks, she wished she could disappear again. She stepped in, pressed the button, and let the doors close on the sound of her unraveling reputation. That night, she sat alone on her couch, the one someone had given her with kindness, but now felt like it bore a hidden price. Her mind raced. Had Ethan helped her out of compassion or guilt? Was this about recognition or pity? She wanted to believe he saw her, truly saw her, but now doubt slithered in like poison, souring everything. She picked up her journal, stared at the blank page, and for the first time didn't write a word. Ethan, on the other side of the city, looked out over the skyline, unable to shake the look in Laura's eyes at the elevator. He didn't know what she'd heard or who had said what, but he could feel it. A shift, a distance. The fragile trust between them was hanging by a thread, and he wasn't sure if it would hold. Laura didn't sleep that night. Her body was exhausted, but her mind refused to rest. The words, "pending termination," and Trevor's cruel insinuation echoed in her head like a chorus of shame. At dawn, she sat by the window, staring out at the grey sky, clutching a mug of coffee she hadn't tasted. Her apartment no longer felt safe. It felt exposed, fragile. But beneath the anxiety, something deeper stirred. She'd been knocked down before, and this time, she wasn't going to stay there. She arrived at work 2 hours early, slipping through the lobby unnoticed. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, but her steps were steady. If they were going to let her go, it wouldn't be without seeing what she was truly capable of. She pulled up the data for a critical project no one wanted to touch. Complex, overdue, and vital for the company's next pitch. No one had asked her to fix it, but she decided to own it anyway. Hours passed. She skipped lunch, ignored the ache in her neck, and powered through endless spreadsheets, finding errors others had missed. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her heart pounding not from fear, but focus. Around her, the office filled and emptied. People whispered, gossiped, speculated. Laura didn't hear a word. Her world had narrowed to numbers and possibilities. She would show them who she really was. In the executive suite, Ethan stood at the glass wall of his office, watching the city breathe beneath him. But his thoughts weren't on the skyline. They were downstairs, on her. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Laura's face in the elevator, bruised by betrayal, shadowed by hurt. He hadn't confronted Trevor. He hadn't defended her, and that silence, more than anything, haunted him. Still, he couldn't bring himself to speak to her. Not yet. The lines between them were too blurred, too fragile. So instead, he did what he did best: observe. From reports and security logs, he saw her clock in early, take no breaks, submit revisions no one expected. He read her project updates with quiet awe. She was working like her life depended on it, because maybe in some ways it did. Back in her apartment that night, Laura sat on the edge of her new bed, feet still in her worn-out shoes. Her journal lay open beside her, untouched for days. Finally, she picked up her pen. Her hand hovered for a moment before she wrote just one sentence. "If I fall, let it be fighting." The ink bled slightly on the page, and so did her heart, but it was the first step back to herself. Far from the world of corporate deadlines, Ethan sat in a silent room lit only by a single photograph. It showed him, years younger, smiling beside an older man with silver hair and kind eyes. His mentor, Charles Langston, the man who had believed in him when no one else did. Ethan remembered his voice. Don't just build an empire, build people. But somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten that. He'd lost Charles to cancer 2 years earlier. The man who taught him to lead with empathy had vanished in a sea of numbers and shareholders. But watching Laura now, fighting silently and without recognition, Ethan felt something return. A reminder, a choice. Was he going to let greed erase what little humanity was left in the business? Or would he finally act like the man Charles had raised him to be? As Laura fell asleep that night, sore and spent, she had no idea that someone was watching from afar, not with pity but admiration. And Ethan, for the first time in years, didn't feel like a CEO behind glass. He felt like a man standing at the edge of something real, something terrifying, something worth saving. But the question still lingered between them like smoke. Could either of them risk crossing the line? It started with a misplaced email. Laura had stayed late again, finalizing the financial forecast presentation she'd rebuilt from scratch. She was searching her inbox for a specific file when she stumbled upon a message labeled "Confirmation, Anonymous Order Delivery." Her heart stuttered. At first, she thought it was spam. But when she opened the thread and saw Ethan's assistant copied in the communication, her stomach dropped. She read it twice, her hands cold. The message thanked Mr. Reed for arranging the confidential apartment furnishing and requested final approval for the invoice marked "Anonymous Goodwill Gesture." Her vision blurred. It was him. It had been him all along. The groceries, the furniture, the card. Not a miracle, not fate. Ethan. Her breath hitched in her throat. She didn't know whether to cry or scream. For hours she paced her apartment, the comfort around her now feeling complicated. Was it pity, a guilty conscience, some silent debt he thought he owed her? Or had it been kindness, real, raw kindness, from someone too guarded to admit it aloud? She stared at the journal on her nightstand. "If I fall, let it be fighting." But was this a fall, or something else entirely? Meanwhile, Ethan sat in the boardroom, staring blankly at the latest acquisition offer. A rival firm wanted to buy the company outright. Cash deal, full control, guaranteed exit with an obscene profit. "It's the safest move," Harrison Mills said, sipping his scotch like he'd already won. "Clean break, maximum return, no more bleeding resources." Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't, because he was thinking about Laura. About how selling meant dismantling everything, including the very department she had rebuilt with her bare hands. The offer wasn't just a buyout, it was an erasure of loyalty, of people like her. He clenched his jaw. The money was life-changing, but the price, it was too damn high. That night, Ethan stood alone in his penthouse, staring down at the city. The sky was bruised with clouds. The silence was deafening. He could still see her face that day in the stairwell, grateful, unsure, hopeful. And now She knew. He had no idea how she'd feel. Angry, betrayed, touched. A knock at his door jolted him from his thoughts. When he opened it, Laura stood there. No makeup, damp hair from the rain, hands trembling slightly. In her hand, a printout of the email. She didn't say a word, just looked at him with eyes that held every ounce of confusion, gratitude, and pain she couldn't name. He stepped aside. She didn't move. "I needed to know," she said finally, her voice barely above the rain behind her. Was it guilt or something else? Her lip quivered, but she didn't look away. She was done being invisible, done wondering. She had faced storms far worse than the truth, and this time she wanted it out loud. Ethan took a slow breath. The sale offer, the board, the secrets. None of it mattered at that moment. Just her, just honesty. And somewhere deep in the silence between them, something shifted. The beginning of a confrontation, the start of something neither of them could predict, and maybe, just maybe, something worth losing everything for. The room felt too quiet, like the air was waiting to snap. Laura stepped inside Ethan's penthouse with cautious steps, still holding the email that had cracked open everything she thought she understood. He didn't speak at first. He simply closed the door behind her and stood still, as if afraid that one wrong move would shatter what little was left between them. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, a storm of a different kind brewed in their chests. "Why did you do it?" Her voice trembled, but it didn't break. "Why furnish my apartment? Why hide behind some grateful friend when it was you all along?" She didn't ask with accusation. She asked with heartbreak, with the kind of vulnerability that made her knees weak. Ethan walked closer, but not too close. His voice, when it came, was raw. "Because I saw something in you," he said quietly. "Something that reminded me of myself before all this." He gestured around at the glass and steel. "You fight harder than most people who've been handed everything. You don't give up, even when no one's watching. I wasn't trying to pity you, Laura. I just wanted to help someone who deserved more." Laura looked away, blinking fast. "And you thought I wouldn't find out? You thought I'd just keep living in this fantasy, thinking it was magic or kindness from the universe? You don't get to rewrite my story, Ethan." Her voice cracked. "Not without telling me you were holding the pen." Ethan stepped forward now, slowly, like approaching a wounded animal. "I didn't know how to tell you, and by the time I thought I should, it felt too late. Everything I've done in my life has been calculated, strategic. But with you, none of it was planned. You were the first thing that made me act without a reason I could justify on paper." Before either could say more, Ethan's phone rang. He ignored it. Then it rang again, a third time. Finally, he picked it up, and Laura watched the color drain from his face. "It's the board," he muttered. "They've just voted. If I don't accept the buyout tonight, they'll force a takeover." His jaw tensed. "They're threatening to remove me if I resist." A heavy silence fell between them. Laura's heart pounded, but this time it wasn't just fear, it was fire. "Then fight them," she said. "Don't sell out, not just for me, for everyone, for this company. I've been working on something, a model, a restructure plan. It could keep half those jobs and double efficiency within a quarter. Let me show you." Her voice surprised even herself with how steady it was. Ethan blinked, stunned. "You've been building a plan? Without being asked?" Laura nodded. "Because I believe this place is worth saving, and maybe so are we." She held out a USB drive. He took it, staring at her like he was seeing her for the first time, not as an analyst, not as a charity case, but as a partner, a force. As she turned to leave, Laura paused at the door. "You said everything you do is calculated. Then calculate this. If you walk away from this deal and from me, will you be able to live with that silence?" She didn't wait for an answer. She left the question hanging in the air, like the final line of a chapter that had yet to be written. Ethan didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat at the head of the long conference table in his office, Laura's USB plugged into his laptop. Her plan unfolded like a blueprint of hope, bold, strategic, deeply human. She'd done more than save jobs. She'd reimagined the company's future without asking for permission, without seeking applause. As the sun began to rise behind him, Ethan made his decision. He wasn't going to sell, not the company, not its people, not his soul. When the emergency board meeting started later that morning, the atmosphere was tense. The investors came armed with ultimatums and sharp legal language. But Ethan didn't flinch. You want to remove me? Fine. But you'll have to answer to every employee this company abandons. You'll have to explain why we threw away brilliance for a bigger number on a spreadsheet. Then he shared Laura's plan. By the end of his pitch, the room had gone silent. After a long pause, one of the oldest board members leaned forward and asked, "Who wrote this?" Ethan smiled. "One of our analysts. Her name is Laura Collins, and you're going to remember her." The final vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. The sale was postponed, the layoffs were suspended, and Laura's name was no longer buried on page 3 of any list. She was now on page 1 of the company's future. Downstairs, Laura sat at her desk, unaware of the war being fought above her head. When Ethan finally appeared by her cubicle, she almost didn't recognize him without his usual guarded expression. He nodded toward the elevator. "Come with me." She hesitated. "Is this about—" He smiled, an actual, uncalculated smile. "Just trust me." It was the first time he'd asked her that. And she went. He led her to a small, private conference room. On the table was a printed version of her proposal, with the company logo embossed at the top and her name listed as lead strategic contributor. Laura blinked. "What is this?" Ethan looked at her gently. "It's recognition. It's respect. It's everything you've earned, but never demanded." She didn't respond right away. Her throat tightened. For a moment she couldn't speak. Later that week, something changed. People in the office began to treat Laura differently, not because of gossip, but because of admiration. Colleagues asked for her insight. Managers included her in strategy calls. Even the HR director stopped by to personally thank her. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was a force. And she'd built it not by shouting, but by showing up again and again, even when no one was watching. Ethan, too, was changing. The distance he once clung to as a shield now felt unnecessary. He found himself walking through the office more, talking with people he used to overlook, asking questions he never cared to ask. Laura watched him from afar, noting how his posture softened, how he listened more than he spoke. One afternoon, he passed her desk and paused. "Lunch?" he asked. She raised an eyebrow. "As my boss?" He smiled. "No, as someone who sees you." That night, Laura pulled out her journal. For the first time in weeks, she didn't write out of desperation. She wrote with hope. Her old lists were still there, books to read, places to go. But now she added new dreams, bigger ones, ones that scared her in a good way. At the bottom of the page she wrote, "Being seen doesn't change who you are, but it changes what you believe is possible." As the elevator doors closed on another long workday, Laura and Ethan stood side by side. She was laughing at something he'd said, and he was looking at her with quiet awe. In that moment, there were no walls between them, no job titles, no secrets, just two people who had survived the fall and chosen to rise, not alone, but together. Still, one question lingered. Was this the beginning of something, or the calm before one final choice? Months passed. The company didn't just survive, it evolved. Ethan implemented Laura's plan across departments, streamlining without sacrificing people. Productivity soared, but something else shifted too: the atmosphere. Kindness began to replace fear. Trust filtered down through the ranks like sunlight through high windows. And Laura? She wasn't just another analyst anymore. She was a symbol of what it meant to fight quietly and win with grace. One afternoon, Ethan stopped by her new office. Yes, she had one now, with a coffee in one hand and a sheepish smile. "I was wondering," he said, "do you still write in that journal?" She raised an eyebrow. "Sometimes." "Why?" He held out a small, neatly wrapped package. "Because I figured, if a new chapter is starting, you might need new pages." Inside was a leather-bound journal, rich brown with soft pages. On the first one he'd written, "To New Beginnings, and the people who teach us how to start again." Later that week, they met at a quiet cafe tucked away from the city's noise. There was no agenda, no office talk, just two people who had once been strangers, now sharing stories over coffee and gentle laughter. Ethan confessed how long he'd felt alone at the top, how easy it had been to hide behind glass and strategy. Laura admitted she still fought the fear of disappearing, even in success. But now they had something neither had dared to expect: someone who saw them. As they walked through the tree-lined street afterward, Laura reached into her bag and handed him a small gift, a notebook almost identical to the one he'd given her. Inside, a single sentence stretched across the first page in her handwriting: "Sometimes caring is the beginning of everything." Ethan stared at the words for a long moment, his throat tight. Then he looked at her, and he smiled, truly smiled. The camera could have faded there, on the smile, on the trees, on the quiet miracle of connection. But life, real life, doesn't end in perfection. It continues in the ordinary magic of everyday gestures. Laura would go on to lead major projects, mentoring other young women who felt invisible. Ethan would restructure the company culture from the top down, making empathy part of leadership, not a liability. And yet, neither of them would forget the night that changed everything: the champagne, the silence, the choice to carry and be carried. They'd both lost so much before that moment: dignity, certainty, even hope. But what they'd found in each other was something no title, no salary, no office could offer: the courage to be seen and the strength to keep showing up even when no one's watching. Laura still wrote in her journal, but now her words carried more light. "I used to write because I was invisible. Now I write because I'm alive." And Ethan, for all his wealth and intellect, had learned a lesson no business school ever taught: the smallest acts of care could shift the course of an entire life, and sometimes even a company. They never put a name to what was growing between them. It didn't need a label. What mattered was that they kept choosing it, day after day, through storms, through silence, through smiles. Some days were hard, others felt like flying, but whatever came next, they were ready. Have you ever helped someone like this? Or been helped when you needed it the most? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your story. And if this story touched your heart, like the video and subscribe to the channel.